Hello, everybody. I wanted to talk about free will versus determinism today. So, of course, the idea of free will is that basically you're the author of your own destiny and you can choose how to act in this world. And the idea of determinism is that you're really not in control as much as your mind makes you think you are. We have a very rigid deterministic world in that between genetics and the physical laws of nature and your personal experiences in your own environment and how nurture and your culture has shaped you, effectively it's almost like an equation, and you put all of that information into a big machine, and then out the other end comes the very next action you will take. And that idea is it's for everything in your life. So if you choose right now to, I don't know, get up and go run a few laps around a track or something, you're not really choosing to do that. It's that the physical condition of, your surrounding environment and your own genetics and your own life experiences has made it so that you're basically captive to the nature of reality, and you're just following the path that was laid out for you already. That's probably a shitty way of explaining it, but that's as good a job as I could do. Now, we're going to look at Sam Harris argue in favor of determinism. He basically believes that free will is an illusion or a myth. We're going to give you Daniel Dennett's position. Daniel Dennett is another he's considered one of the new atheists, one of the four horsemen of new atheism, but he has a position on free will that's, I think he would describe it as like a middle ground. It's called compatibilism. It tries to marry together some of the ideas of determinism with the idea of free will. And then also we're going to look at Noam Chomsky, who seems to, although he hedges on it in many ways, he seems to hold on to the idea that free will is true. So we're going to have somebody represent the deterministic position, somebody represent kind of the middle ground, which is compatibilist, and then Noam Chomsky represent, one flavor or another of free will. Now, what's interesting about this debate to me is that and I've discussed this a few other times on my show going back years ago, but I was always under the impression that determinism was actually kind of a religious notion, because how many times have you heard in your life the idea of like, oh, it was God's plan? Like, yeah, God has a plan, and issue X happened as a result of God's plan, and therefore, don't worry, because you're really not in the driver's seat. God's in the driver's seat. He's the author of everything, and he already designed it and laid out a path for you, and free will is not real in that conception of the world. If the idea is that God is the author of everything and designed the universe and has a plan, well, then you're just kind of like a passenger seat in the car ride, and God is in the driver's seat. So I always thought determinism was kind of like a religious notion. And in my mind, I thought, well, free will is clearly the idea of, you are responsible for your own actions, and you have the freedom to make decisions in your life. And I always thought that was viewed as the more hardcore scientific perspective. Now, what's interesting is that I wasn't totally right in that impression. It's much more complicated than that. In fact, there are plenty of people who have a naturalistic and humanist version of the world. Many people who are scientific minded who believe determinism is true. And Sam Harris is a good example of that. But there's many others. It's not just him. There are many people who are adherents to the scientific method who think determinism is correct, and it's also the case that there are plenty of religious people who think free will is true. They think that God has given you free will, and then you have to pick how you will act in this world, and if you choose to act morally, then in the afterlife you get rewarded with that, and you end up going to heaven as opposed to hell. That's a religious conception of free will. But anyway, me talking about all this is my long-winded way of explaining how it was more complicated than my impression originally, where, basically my idea was, well, obviously if you're a determinist, you're kind of like a religious crazy person. Not crazy person, that's too strong, but you're religious and that you think God has a plan, so you're just in the passenger seat, and everybody who is rational believes in free will. It turns out it's much more complicated than that, and it's actually a mix. There are plenty of people who are and aren't religious who believe in free will, and plenty of people who are and aren't religious who believe in determinism. Okay, having said that, let's jump in. We're going to start with the determinist position. This is Sam Harris. I'll probably pause as we go along here and weigh in with my thoughts.
But I want to suggest to you that the problem of free will is actually deeper than this. It's deeper than the problem of cause and effect.
By the way, I put it on 1.5 speed, so my bad if you're not used to that. I used to hate the speed up thing, but now I love it. You just have to kind of get used to listening that quickly, but once you do get used to it, I can't imagine myself going back and listening to stuff on regular speed. But this is 1.5 speed, so if it's annoying you, you could just slow it down on your own end here.
And most people think that we have, the problem is we have a subjective experience of free will, but it can't be mapped onto physical reality. I'm about to argue that free will doesn't even correspond to any subjective fact about us. And if you pay attention...
Okay, let me just say right off the bat, I don't agree with that at all. Yeah, of course, the subjective experience that everybody has is that they have free will. And listen, don't take my word for it. Think about in your own mind how you feel. How do you feel on a day-to-day basis? Do you feel like you are making decisions and you're, a free agent, if you will, and you are deciding what happens? I certainly feel that way. Now, he's going to go on and qualify that statement by saying, you just have to look a little deeper under the surface, and then you see where I'm coming from. But just at face value, I don't agree with that at all. I think the opposite is true. Everybody kind of has that feeling that they, subjectively, that they have free will. Let's continue.
To your experience closely, you can notice this. If you pay attention, you can see that you no more decide the next thing you think than the next thing I say. Thoughts simply appear in consciousness. Very much like my words. What are you going to think next? What am I going to say next? I could suddenly start talking about the pleasures of snowshoeing. Where did that come from? From your point of view, it came out of nowhere. But the same thing is happening in the privacy of your own mind. You've all made an effort to be here and to stay this extra hour presumably to hear what I have to say about free will. But there's also a voice in your head that is just saying things. Haven't you noticed? And many of these things have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. You're struggling to follow my train of thought, but there's competition. You suddenly start thinking things like, I should probably stop drinking diet soda. Thoughts just emerge in consciousness. We are not authoring them. That would require that we think them before we think them. If you can't control your next thought, and you don't know what it's going to be until it arises, where is your freedom of will? Now, at this moment, many of you are thinking, what the hell is he talking about? Here's what I'm talking about. You didn't pick that thought either. We'll come back to this one.
Okay, let me just say, so what's interesting about the argument he's making here is I think it's a distinction without a difference from a lot of people who believe in free will, because that would still be defined as you. So in other words, you have thoughts popping up in your mind, and he's saying, well, where are they coming from? Like, that's not you. Like, you think you get to make the final decision on the thoughts that pop up in your mind, but you don't know where the thoughts come up that pop up in your mind. They just show up. So what's weird about that is I actually think that this might be a little too strong of a statement, but I think that's almost unscientific, because it's coming from your subconscious mind or unconscious mind. So, like, yes, thoughts are popping up in consciousness, but that's your consciousness that thoughts are popping up in. So I think that it's almost like just a semantics issue at the end of it, because somebody can totally grant him this point he's making and still believe in free will. Because they just say, okay, I am defining that as you. So in other words, he's arguing you're not the thinker of thoughts. The thoughts pop up in your mind, and you don't know where they come from. And then the counterpoint I'm making to that is, well, no, that's still you. It's still your mind where those thoughts are popping up. So it's like it just strikes me as he's making a distinction without a difference, and somebody who believes in free will can concede his point here. But anyway, let's continue.
Of course, in a sense, we do think our thoughts before we think them, or at least our brain does. And much of this thinking is something we never hear about. We're conscious of only a tiny fraction of the information that our brains process in each moment. We continually notice changes in our experience, in thoughts and moods and sensations and behavior, but we are utterly unaware of the neurophysiological events that produce those changes. We consider the sensation of touching your finger to your nose. Feel free to try this. There's no shame in this. The contact appears simultaneous, okay, but we know at the level of the brain that it can't be. We know that the input from the finger reaches sensory cortex after the input from the nose. And this is true no matter how short your arms or long your nose. Now, if you're of a mind to experiment, it works with your toes also. So, our brains correct for this timing discrepancy by clearly buffering the inputs in memory and then delivering the apparent simultaneity to consciousness. So our experience of the present moment is in a very real sense a memory of the present moment. And even the simplest conscious sensations are built upon unconscious mechanism and unconscious processing of which we are fundamentally unaware. Now, needless to say, this unconscious machinery also governs what we think and feel and do and intend as well, not just perception. And that is where notions of free will and moral responsibility begin to get squeezed. And many people have now demonstrated in a lab that persons' choices, behavioral choices, voluntary choices, can be detected some moments, sometimes seconds, before they are consciously aware of having made the choice. So the physiologist Benjamin LeBay quite famously did this with EEG, but this basic paradigm has been replicated with fMRI and even direct recordings from the cortex in surgical patients. In each of these experiments, people are given a very simple task to push a left button as opposed to a right button, or to move their left hand versus their right hand, and they just have to watch a clock and decide when they were first consciously aware of committing to the left or the right. Okay, and you do this, and several experiments over the years have shown that people can go back and forth as much as they want. They become consciously aware of when they're committed, they make their choice, and yet the experimenters, by scanning the brains for one modality or another, know some half a second, depending on what the decision is, even several seconds before they do what they're going to do. Okay, so as a result of this work, it's actually scientifically uncontroversial to say that some moments before you are aware of what you are going to do, in making a simple voluntary action, at a time at which you appear to be subjectively free to do whatever you want, your brain has already determined what it is you will do. And then you become gradually aware of this decision while you still think you're in the process of making it. Now, needless to say, this is very difficult to reconcile with conventional notion of free will, because this timing discrepancy demonstrates that it would be possible for someone to know what you're going to do before you do, and while you still think you're free to make up your mind. But the truth is, I think actually too much has been made of this research. The truth is, even if there were no time lag, even if a conscious intention were truly simultaneous with its neurophysiological underpinnings, there would still be no room for free will, because you still wouldn't know why it is you do what you do. And again, this is a fact you can notice about yourself directly. Let's run a little experiment. Think of a city, anywhere in the world. You can choose any city you want. Now, of course, I could have primed you. I could have artfully placed cues in my speech in the last few minutes that would make you more likely to think of...
Just real quick, I want to say about the point about the study that shows they could predict the decision you make before you make it. I think that's interesting research, and Sam Harris seems to think that it indicates that, okay, there's no such thing as free will. There is a rebuttal to that. I'm not going to mention the rebuttal at this moment, but Noam Chomsky actually addresses that directly in his comments. So I just wanted to throw that out there real quick. And he's going to go on now to talk about how, again, well, he says even if that wasn't the case, you still, like, even if that research didn't exist, he thinks it's still, you still can't say that you have free will, because, again, he kind of goes back to his original point here, which is you don't really know where those thoughts come from in your mind. The thoughts just kind of pop up in your own mind. But then again, I argue that's more of a semantic issue, because it's still, those thoughts are still appearing in your mind. So, you could say, hey, you got to having those thoughts pop up in your mind because of your DNA and your lived experience and whatever just happened to you at fucking breakfast or whatever you saw on a billboard or something. But the fact that thoughts are popping up in your mind, it is still your mind. So the idea of like not ascribing your ownership to those thoughts, I just think is a little... I have a hard time grasping that, because again, I think ultimately his description strikes me, not that he's doing it on purpose by any stretch of the imagination, but it strikes me as a little bit of a semantic game. It's like, well, that's not really you because those thoughts are appearing. It's like, well, yeah, but they're appearing in your mind, so that is you almost by definition. But let's continue.
Las Vegas, for instance. So just to be on the safe side, don't pick Vegas. But pick a city, any city, and just pay attention to what this conscious process is like. Now, the first thing to notice about this is as free a decision as you are ever going to make in your life. Okay, you have all the cities in the world to choose from, and I'm just asking you to pick one. Now, several cities have probably occurred to you, and just focus on one. So everybody got a city? No, I'm sorry to say that you all picked the wrong city. Don't ask me how I know this, but I do. So I just want you to do this again, just so you can see what the process is like. Pick another city, can't be the first, and notice what that experience is like. Okay. Did you see any evidence for free will? Now, we better be able to find it here. I mean, if it's not here, it's not anywhere. So let's look for it. First, let's set aside all those cities whose names you don't know and therefore could not have picked. Okay, because you couldn't have picked one of those if your life depended on it. There's no freedom in that, obviously. Okay, and then there are many other cities whose names are quite well known to you, but which simply didn't occur to you to pick. For instance, perhaps Cairo didn't occur to you. You absolutely know that Cairo is a city, but for whatever reason, your Cairo circuits were not engaged. Okay, as a matter of neurophysiology, Cairo was not in the cards. So I want you to think about this. Were you free to choose that which did not occur to you to choose? Okay, based on the state of your brain a few moments ago, Cairo was not coming. Okay, where is the freedom in that?
Okay, this is another one of those arguments I don't really get the point he's trying to make, because he's basically saying, and he actually goes on to make the point, like, okay, look at it like a movie. If we could rewind time to when I asked you to come up with a city, like, could you have conceivably picked something else? And that's a weird way of putting it, because what he's asking is, it's almost like a tautology. It's like things are how they are by definition, so can they be different? It's like, well, no, if you ask it like that, of course, things are what they are. So, no, it couldn't be different if you're just describing what is and saying if we rewind it like it's a movie and press play, could it be different? But that doesn't strike me as anything other than a tautology. It doesn't mean that conceivably or theoretically, you actually couldn't have, given, slightly different circumstances, you couldn't have other, parts of your brain firing that give you a different answer to the question. So I don't really understand the point that he's trying to make here. But you see this a lot where, and I think Daniel Dennett touches on this, where people who are hardcore determinists, this is an argument that they make where they say, okay, look at the way things unfolded. If you could go back to 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever, could you conceivably have changed it? And I mean, the very premise of the question being that we're in a state of reality right now where everything was a certain way, it's like, well, no, because if you're assuming that the state of reality is the same as it is today, but we rewind time, well, then if we're still going to end up in this same place and time, then no, by definition, it couldn't have changed. It's a tautology to say that. But that doesn't strike me as a point. It strikes me as like a non-point. Because, again, if you use the example like a movie, it's like saying, okay, if you press rewind on an actual movie, whatever, you pick the movie, Mighty Ducks or Tombstone, like, if we press rewind, will it be the same thing? Well, yeah, by definition it'll be the same thing because it's the same fucking movie. But that doesn't mean that it's not conceivably or theoretically possible that the outcome could change given slight tweaks in one direction or another, whether it be tweaks in genetic code or tweaks in, the environmental or cultural experience of a given person. So I don't really, this doesn't strike me as a very compelling point. It just strikes me as a really long way to point out a tautology. But let's watch the rest of this, and then I also want to bring in Daniel Dennett. Kind of addresses that point, and he makes the point, I don't want to spoil it now, but he talks about inevitability versus evitability. Evitability is a word you never hear, but inevitability is a word you hear all the time, oh, that was inevitable. And this is something that determinists kind of throw around loosey-goosey, where it's well, the future is inevitable. It's well, what? That sentence actually doesn't even make sense. That's an incoherent thing to say, but it's something that a determinist would actually believe. It's oh, it's not possible for anything to change in the future. So of course you can change things moving into the future. Of course you can look at the most likely scenario that would unfold given the current state of reality, and you can tweak that. So, and this is something, again, that a determinist would say, no, you can't do that. But let's listen to the rest of Harris, and then we'll get to Dennett.
Of course, if you think of Cairo, you should consider yourself a genius. Now, so you probably thought of several cities. And then let's say you thought of Paris and New York and Tokyo. And then you thought, I love Paris. I'm going to go with Paris. And the last minute you thought, no, Tokyo, I'll go with Tokyo. Now, this is the sort of decision that motivates the idea of free will. You've got two or more choices, and you're picking between them, and it's just you and your thoughts. There's no coercion from the external world. You are doing it, apparently. But when you look closely, I think you'll find that you are in no position to know why you picked what you picked. In this case, why you chose Tokyo over Paris. And you might have some additional story to tell about it. You might think, well, I had Japanese food last night, and so I remembered it, and I picked Tokyo. Now, of course, we know from psychology that these kinds of stories are rather often false. Whenever people are manipulated in a lab, they always have some tale to tell about why they did what they did, and it never bears any relationship to the actual variables that cause them to behave that way. So you give people, you can cause people to like one person more than another, or to cooperate more in economic games by simply giving them a hot beverage to hold as opposed to a cold one. And they never tell you that the reason they were biased as they were was because the temperature of the cup in their hands. Okay, psychology is replete with evidence that we are very poor judges of why it is we do what we do. But even if you're right in this instance, even if your choice of Tokyo over Paris is based on your memory of having Japanese food last night, you still can't explain why you remembered having Japanese food last night, or why the memory had the effect that it did. Why didn't it have the opposite effect? Why didn't you think, well, I just had Japanese food last night, so let's go with something new, let's go with Paris?
That's another weird point in my opinion, because you can take two different people and they will in fact have that opposite effect, which some might look at as evidence of some sort of free will. So you can run the experiment of, say, two people born around the same time, very similar genetic makeup, very similar culture and environment and life experience up to a certain point, and then you actually can get a giant variation in where they go from there. So, conceivably somebody can be brought up, let's say in a bad neighborhood, and, they had a tough life, they were surrounded by gangs, and very few job opportunities, and they end up staying in that same neighborhood and kind of go through the cycle and join the gang, and it is conceivable, and it has happened, that people born around the same time, similar genetic makeup and background, similar culture, and the opposite happens, and they end up breaking free of that. So now this is where, somebody like Harris or any determinist would have to argue, well, yeah, but it wasn't the exact same person. So there's no evidence there of will. But it's you go back to the point that that's a tautology if it's the same person. If it's the exact same person, it is by definition the same person, so by definition, the same actions would be taken by that same person. So again, that's not a very convincing point to me. I think the opposite is convincing, that if you have a similar circumstance for people and one ends up going in a wildly different direction, that's evidence of the possibility of choice. Now, again, he could say that choice can be made from that choice is a result of unconscious things going on in your mind at a level that you don't fully grasp at your conscious level, and I'd say, okay, I agree with that, but I don't think that negates the overall point.
The city you settled on, in subjective terms, than you would have if I picked it for you. It was the first moment I said, pick a city, and there's this hiatus where nothing has occurred to you. And then the names of cities start to get promoted into consciousness for reasons you can't inspect. And you can't choose the cities you think of before you think of it. It's almost like me saying Tel Aviv, Vancouver, Paris, and you simply hearing the words in consciousness. So if you pay attention to how thoughts and intentions arise and how decisions get made moment to moment, I think you can see that there's no evidence for free will, that actually our experience in life is compatible with the truth of determinism. Now, it's also important to recognize that the case I'm building against free will does not depend upon philosophical materialism, the idea that reality is at bottom physical. Now, there are very good reasons to believe that mind is at bottom physical. Certainly most mental events are the product of physical events. The brain is a physical system, entirely beholden to the laws of nature. But even if we have souls, even if the human mind were made of soul stuff that we don't understand, nothing about my argument would change. The unconscious operations of a soul grant you no more freedom than the unconscious neurophysiology of your brain does. If you don't know what your soul is going to do next, you're not in control of your soul.
He goes on to argue that the moral impact of believing in determinism is a net positive, because then that means you can look at somebody and say, well, they're not really responsible for their actions because none of us are really responsible for our actions in the traditional sense, where you made a choice to commit a crime, for example. So therefore, you can set up a criminal justice system that's more geared towards, I guess, rehabilitation than punishment, because if what's the sense in punishing somebody if they weren't really responsible for their actions? It's almost like we've carved out an exception in law for people who have IQ below a certain level, because the idea is, well, they're not really responsible for their action. They didn't know what they were doing. So we have a lighter punishment for somebody who has a low IQ and commits the same crime as somebody who did it and has a high IQ, and they seemingly knew the consequences of their action, but they did it anyway. So it's interesting that he's using the idea of determinism towards actually a more progressive and liberal end goal, which is, okay, let's have a criminal justice system that's less punitive because people aren't really as responsible for their actions as we think they are in the traditional sense. Now, that's interesting, and I certainly agree with the end goal there, but I also think you could come to the opposite conclusion if determinism is true, which is, if they're going to do what they're going to do anyway, because they don't have moral agency or the ability to make a choice, well then, isn't it also logical to maybe say, hey, we should keep criminals away from society perhaps forever? If somebody's a criminal and they did something terrible, whether it's whatever, robbery, assault, rape, murder, something like that, and they don't have moral agency, and they didn't make a choice, they weren't free to make a choice to do the opposite, well then, that's a scary robot, if you will, to have out in society now, isn't it? It's a robot that's already shown they have the capacity to do evil, so actually, you can take the other conclusion away, which is, because if you believe determinism is true, you actually should be in favor of a further right-wing justice system where, not that you're punitive, but you're just aware of, of what people are capable of, so you want to keep them away from society for even longer. So I don't think that having a more left-wing, progressive, rehabilitative justice system necessarily follows from determinism being true, but Sam Harris does seem to think that, that kind of a justice system would flow from determinism being true. So now let's look at Daniel Dennett. I have a few clips of him here. He's going to talk about free will. And compatibilism is his position.
Most people think consciousness, whatever it is just supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. It's something so wonderful, 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 wonderful that we have to sort of divide the universe in two to make room for it, all on one side, all by itself. And I understand why they think that, and I think it's just wrong. It is wonderful. It's astonishingly wonderful, but it is not a miracle, and it isn't magic. It's a bunch of tricks. And it really is. I like the comparison with magic, because stage magic, of course, is not magic. It's a bunch of tricks. And consciousness is a bunch of tricks in the brain. And we're learning what those tricks are and how they fit together, and why it seems to be so much more than that bunch of tricks. Now, for a lot of people, the very suggestion that that might be so is offensive or repugnant. They really don't like that idea.
Okay, I don't necessarily agree with that. Well, there are people who say, think it's repugnant and offensive to argue that consciousness is a bunch of tricks that our mind plays on us. But I think there are also rational reasons to think that might not be the case. Now, I don't know. In fact, I think it's probably likely the case that Daniel Dennett is right in that consciousness could be a bunch of tricks our mind plays on us effectively. So, in other words, given the requisite conditions, you can have consciousness arise artificially. Like, you can maybe create something, like you have artificial intelligence, that's obviously a thing, artificial intelligence. But in other words, if you go far along enough down the path, the lights go on for the artificial intelligence, where they have the same kind of conscious experience that you and I have. So he might be right, and, I don't know how far I lean in his direction. Maybe I lean 55% in his direction, 45% against him. But I think it's possible we just don't know enough yet. Like, I think it might be the case that human beings are just massively ignorant on the issue of consciousness and what really consciousness is, and we don't have the ability to explain it yet because we don't have the requisite scientific knowledge or proper concepts to explain it yet. So there's a chance that it's not consciousness being some sort of trick that our own mind plays on us. There might be something somewhat special about it. I don't mean special in the religious sense, that there's a God that endowed us with this consciousness, or that there's always the religious concept of the soul. I'm not saying that we have a soul. I'm not saying in any metaphysical, religious, or supernatural sense that there's something special about consciousness. I'm just saying there might be something special about consciousness that's decoupled from any religious understanding of, consciousness being special. And I think that's something that scientifically minded people can, believe. And Noam Chomsky actually kind of points out a similar thing. Again, you'll hear him in a little bit. But the idea, I think he's a little too certain on that point. That consciousness is just, a series of tricks that our mind plays on us, where you think you have free will and you think you have consciousness, but it's not necessarily that cut and dry, and it's just like a magic trick. Maybe. Or maybe we just don't know enough yet, and maybe that's not the case, and, 200 years in the future, there'll be a scientific breakthrough that can explain actually in depth exactly what that subjective experience of consciousness is, that we're just totally ignorant to at the current moment. So let's keep watching.
And they view it as an assault, sort of an assault on their dignity or their specialness. And I think that's a prime mistake. It's a mistake because it means if you think that way, you're going to systematically ignore the paths of exploration, of research, that might tend to confirm that. And you're going to hold out for mystery. You're going to hold out for more specialness than is really there. And some people just can't help themselves. They can't take seriously. They won't take seriously the idea that consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain. And they say, I just can't imagine it. And I say, no, you won't imagine it. You can imagine it. You're just not trying. I think the hidden agenda, and not so hidden very often for all of this, is the concern about free will. I think that at the bottom of the barrel, what people are really worried about is that if we have an entirely naturalistic and ultimately, in a certain sense, mechanistic at the nano level, at the protein level, if we have a mechanistic theory of consciousness, this will show that, oh my gosh, we don't have free will, and then life has no meaning, and I can't be responsible for my best or worst deeds, and that doesn't follow. But fear that it would follow rattles people and deflects them from taking these ideas seriously because they really don't want them to be true. My approach to that is to challenge that desire and say, no, everything you want or should want in the way of free will, you can have on this picture. There's some traditional notions of free will that turn out to be impossible on this view. Tough. But why do you want them? They're not important. They are simply ill-founded desires. The varieties of free will worth wanting, you can have. And so take a deep breath, relax, and let's figure out how it's done. For billions of years on this planet, there was life but no free will. Physics hasn't changed, but now we have free will. The difference is not in physics. It has nothing to do with determinism or indeterminism. It has to do with, ultimately, with biology, particularly evolutionary biology. What has happened over those billions of years is that greater and greater competences have been designed and have evolved. And the competence of a dolphin or of a chimpanzee, the cognitive competence, the sort of mental competence, is hugely superior to the competence of a lobster or a starfish. But ours dwarfs the competence of a dolphin or a chimpanzee, perhaps even greater extent. And there's an entirely naturalistic story to tell about how we came to have that competence or those competences. And it's that can-do, it's that power that we have, which is natural, but it's that power which sets us aside from every other species. And the key to it is that we don't just act for reasons, we represent our reasons to ourselves and to others. The business of asking somebody, why did you do that? And the person being able to answer it's a very simple and it's an everyday phenomenon, but it is the key. And it is the key to responsibility. And in fact, the word responsibility sort of wears its meaning on its sleeve. We are responsible because we can respond to challenges to our reasons. Why? Because we don't just act for reasons, we act for reasons that we consciously represent to ourselves. And this is what gives us the power and the obligation to think ahead, to anticipate, to see the consequences of our action, to be able to evaluate those consequences in the light of what other people tell us, to share our wisdom with each other. No other species can do anything like it. And it's because we can share our wisdom that we have a special responsibility. It's, as the old habit, it's noblesse oblige. We have the power, and that's what gives us the obligation. And that's what makes us free in a way that no bird is free, for instance.
Okay, so that's interesting. That's an interesting argument. He's saying we have the capacity to comprehend what the ideal action is in a certain circumstance and then judge and measure our own actions in the process. So, smoking cigarettes, for example. We know through countless studies that cigarettes are likely to cause emphysema and lung cancer and all these health issues. So you can sit down and judge it and go, the long-term effects of smoking are all of these potential diseases and downsides. So given this knowledge, the ideal action would be, in this case, to avoid the cigarettes in the first place so as to not possibly experience those negative consequences down the road. So that's a human being making a kind of moral judgment, or just making a judgment, perhaps not moral in this circumstance, but a judgment that, a dolphin or a chimpanzee doesn't have the capacity to make that judgment. And that's just one example of, and that's a definition of free will that I think kind of makes sense. So we know that, there are laws of nature, for example. There are physical laws. Those are very deterministic. We know what they are. There's, all the science in the world points to their existing. You can have a deterministic universe in that respect, but also have enough room for free will, given that explanation. So we can have free will within the confines and the rules of a game that is deterministic. And that's effectively the point that Daniel Dennett's making, and he's kind of laying out the compatibilist view. Let's watch one more here, and he'll lay it out even more.
Dan, if I were to believe in materialism, physicalism, that everything in my mind is my brain, and everything is determined in a physical world, how then can I have free will?
I think this is the hidden agenda for all of the consciousness work, and particularly the controversy around it. People want to know about free will. They want to protect free will, and so they should. It's very important. But what they also have to realize is that free will is just as hard to reconcile with indeterminism. If the world is undetermined, it's just as hard to see how you could have free will that mattered, because you want to determine what you do. It's really interesting that we use this word determined, and mainly it's a term of praise. We say, she's so determined, and so we should. We want to determine our actions, but we don't want us to be determined in the determining of our actions. Now, I think that people have been looking in the wrong place for 2,000 years and more on this. They've been looking at physics, determinism, indeterminism, physics. They should have been looking at biology, because the key to free will is understanding that free will is a biological level phenomenon. It's not a physical level phenomenon. We are freer than our parts. Our parts don't have free will, but we do. Now, how could that possibly be?
Without adding something extra.
Without adding anything mysterious. So we have to make free will compatible with determinism.
Right.
But we're not going to say that our actions aren't determined, but we're going to show that they're not inevitable. Now, the most natural thing in the world to say is, if my future is determined, then it's inevitable. What on earth does that mean? Compare. If my future is determined, it's determined. That's true. That's just the tautology. So what does the word inevitable add? What does it mean more than determined? If we want to get clear on this, we have to see what inevitable means. It means unavoidable. So then we have to get clear about what avoiding is. And then we can begin to see the biological dimension. Because what's happened on this planet over the last 4 billion years has been an explosion of avoiding. Avoiding dissolution, avoiding being eaten, avoiding starving to death. What evolution has done is designed organisms that do a little bit of avoiding. And there's been an arms race, and the avoiders have become cleverer and cleverer and cleverer. And how do you avoid something? You avoid something by anticipating it and then taking corrective measures.
Right.
Simplest case, incoming brick. You see it, you duck, you avoid it. You say, well, you see, I avoided that incoming brick. Well, was it ever really going to hit you? No, because the light bounced off the brick into your eyes. You saw it in time so that you ducked. So suppose you were determined to duck. Well, then the brick was never going to hit you, was it? It just seemed as if it was going to hit you. What we have to understand is that free will is our capacity to see probable futures that seem like they're going to happen, in time to take steps so that something else happens instead. Now,
This is exactly what I was describing before. Human beings have the capacity to come up with an ideal circumstance and then judge yourself in accordance with what that ideal circumstance would be.
People say, you can't change the past. That's true.
Yeah.
You can't change the future either. From what to what? I mean, the future is what happens next. But what you can do is change what you thought the future was going to be into something else. And this is the key to avoiding.
Here's my problem. I see at the physics level this absolute determinism of particle and particle from way back. Now at the biological level, we're talking about avoidance. So how does the avoidance help us to avoid the determinism? Because it is determined.
Well, it is determined, but just remember that that's not as important as people have thought, because it doesn't apply inevitability.
I hate to tell you the conclusion I seem to be coming to. I'm embarrassed to tell you, but I seem to feel, if it's all physical, that free will, there's something wrong with that definition, or
Exactly.
I can't deal with the traditional definition of free will under either scenario,
Right.
determinism or indeterminism, unless I add something extra and some non-physical stuff. Then I can get my free will.
I think that's right. I think we have to recognize that, sure, there are varieties of free will, the traditional varieties, which, who cares whether we've got them? The varieties that matter, the varieties of free will worth wanting, as I've said, are perfectly compatible with determinism. Now, do we have to give up something? Yeah, we have to give up some of the ideology about freedom. We also have to give up something, and good riddance to it, about blame and responsibility.
That would scare some people.
I think so. They want to be absolutist about responsibility. I mean, the idea of just in the eyes of God, sin, that has to go. But what we replace it with is still a very rich and familiar concept. And that is, we're not deluded about our sense of our own capacity. We are determined to be the masters of our fate to a surprisingly gratifying degree.
Okay, so now let's hop on over to Noam Chomsky. He's going to give you, well, there's 3 little clips here of Chomsky. I think in some of them, he gives like kind of an agnostic take between free will and determinism, and then in some clips, like this one you're about to see right now, he seems like he just believes in free will.
Like the kind of work that I mentioned, John Mikhail, others, are carrying out the beginnings of experimental work, which sheds light on, and may ultimately shed a lot of light on, what our innate moral principles are, what Hume was looking for example, and Adam Smith and others. That could shed some light on it. So I don't think it's going to tell you much about freedom of the will. Freedom of the will, I think we're stuck pretty much where Descartes was. We just can't abandon believing it. It's our most immediate, phenomenologically obvious impression, but we can't explain it. And as he said, if there's something which we just know to be true, and we don't have any explanation for it, well, too bad for our explanatory possibilities.
Okay, so this is something you see routinely in Noam Chomsky's work. He makes that point a lot, where he kind of stresses that human beings, we're not all knowing. And in fact, there are some things that we might not have the capability to know at all. Like, our minds may be too feeble to grasp it. I mean, if you look at a gorilla, you know that there's no way that that gorilla is going to learn quantum physics. It doesn't matter how much you try to teach it to the gorilla, It just doesn't have the ability to do it. It's not possible. It hasn't evolved to a point where that's an option for it. Well, by the same token, Noam Chomsky makes this point very often that, listen, yes, I mean, it's almost like we get this false impression that human beings can almost know everything and like unlock the key to all knowledge because seemingly we've learned so much to this point. I mean, if we learned about, certain diseases, we created vaccines, we know in many ways how we got to this point with certain theories. We know evolution got us to where we are. We know that the universe is about 14.8 billion years old. So there are things that we know that might give somebody the misimpression that, like, well, I mean, if we were able to go figure out this much, well, then there's nothing that we can't, given enough time, figure out. And Noam Chomsky has been very critical of that idea for a long time, where he says, look, we just simply might be too feeble-minded to grasp certain concepts. And this is effectively the point that he's making in regards to free will, where we just might not, it's obvious, his point is, it's obvious that we have it, it's so subjectively, overwhelmingly obvious that we have it, but we don't know how to comprehend it and quantify it and discuss it in any serious, measurable way. And his point is, as apparently was Descartes', well, so much for our ability to explain it then. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, simply because we can't explain it, therefore it doesn't exist. Or try to explain it away in many respects with some kind of rigid deterministic arguments. So that's an interesting point, and I have to say that point did resonate with me. And I know everybody's going to say, here goes Kyle again, Chomsky fanboy. But remember, keep in mind, I was discussing this the other day when we were talking about the UN report on the world happiness. There was a world happiness report that the UN came out with that they do every few years, and Scandinavia was top of the list again. And just to give one example of where I disagree with Chomsky, that's one right there. I mean, Chomsky's, I think, significantly to the left of me on broader political questions. And I think he's maybe too idealistic, if you will, about what human beings are capable of in the long run when it comes to what we can achieve politically. So I have I'm pretty significantly to the right of him on the political spectrum. But having said that, this point that he's making here really resonated with me, where I said, yeah, I mean, I could see that. I could see us just not having the answer yet, but there's still appearing to be some kind of truth to the notion of free will.
But I don't see any way of getting around that. I mean, there's a lot of arguments that we don't have freedom of the will. And those arguments, there's a ton of literature on that. And the literature is kind of interesting, actually for reasons that William James discussed. He said, if you believe that there's no freedom of the will, why bother presenting an argument? You're forced to do it. The person you're talking to can't be convinced because there's no such thing as reasons. So why not watch a baseball game? That wasn't his example. But
okay, that's a point that determinists hate when you make it, and they think it's kind of like a flippant thing to say. But I think that's kind of true. If you believe in determinism, well then, trying to argue to get somebody to agree with you is basically the same thing as turning on one radio and then grabbing a second radio, putting it next to that radio, and turning it on. In no meaningful way is there a conversation or a discussion actually happening there where one has the capacity to choose to change their mind, because choice is an illusion. You don't have free will. You don't have the freedom to choose. You can't course correct. So if the world is rigidly deterministic, then having a conversation is like turning on two radios and pointing them at each other and expecting something to change. So I know that determinists don't like it when people who believe in free will make that point, but I think that point kind of stands, because it would be a fundamental absurdity if you really believed in determinism to try to change somebody's mind on it.
Anybody who denies freedom of the will actually believes that it's there. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother presenting reasons. I mean, unless they say, look, I'm just forced to present it. I can't do anything else but present these reasons. And it's very, very odd, these discussions, many of them. Actually, you may have seen some experimental work, which caused a big flurry a couple of years ago. Some neurophysiologists discovered that If a person's going to carry an act of willed action, let's say, pick this up, say, you can find activity in the motor centers of the brain before there's a decision to pick it up, okay? And that was held to show, okay, we've undermined freedom of the will. It doesn't say anything. All it says is what we ought to know anyway. Decisions are mostly made unconsciously. By the time they reach the level of consciousness, they've probably already been made. But that doesn't tell anything about how decisions are made.
My question relates to the previous question, actually.
So that was the rebuttal to the Harris point. Now, again, Harris maintains that even if that research didn't exist, you still don't really have free will. But, Noam Chomsky's arguing that doesn't mean you don't have free will. It just means that your decisions are made unconsciously. And again, my counter-argument to Harris there is that's still you. Like, those thoughts are still popping up in your mind. So the thoughts are coming from you, even though you feel like you don't know where they're coming from because they just appear in your mind. So anyway, now this questioner kind of brings up the exact same question, and Chomsky's going to respond to it.
Free will. As a philosopher, I'd like to ask you this question. Studies have shown that decisions made in the brain actually appear some moments before an individual. Well, how can you then say that there is such a thing as free will? I mean, thus, wiring, determinism, it proves that free will basically doesn't exist.
Those are the experiments I was just referring to. There are some experiments which show that in a willed action, simple willed motor action, picking something up, there is activity in the relevant parts of the motor cortex before the decision to pick it up is conscious. Okay, that tells us absolutely nothing about freedom of the will, except that choices are probably unconscious. But I think we know that without the experiments. What? Complicated? Oh yeah. Anything in this area is very complicated. When we understand nothing, everything's complicated. Yeah. It's another truism.
Okay, so that's part one. Let's see what he says. Part two. This one's.
The primary attribute of supernatural thinking is that there are magical entities or forces which control the fate of humanity. On the contrary, most naturalists argue that humans are actually just one sort of animal, very much part of the natural world. This then means that our behaviors are determined by some combination of our genetic makeup and the environment from birth to death, and how that environment acts on those genes. Do you think such a naturalism leaves open the possibility of free will, which seems to contradict our notion of cause and effect universe?
No, it doesn't contradict anything. It just says that we don't know whether the phenomenon that we all experience, and it's our most immediate experience, the phenomenon of freedom of will is a real aspect of the universe that we simply don't comprehend yet or maybe ever, or whether it's an illusion that can be explained in some other fashion. That question just remains open. And there's plenty of things we don't understand. For example, we don't really have an intuitive grasp of something which now naturalists take for granted, namely that if I move my hand, I'm moving the moon. That there can be interaction at a distance. When Newton proposed that, he regarded it as a total absurdity. That's why which is, he said, no person of sound scientific understanding can imagine to be true for a moment. In fact, he spent the rest of his life trying to find some way to get around it, as did leading scientists of not only his day, but for centuries afterwards. It finally became scientific common sense. Well, there are things about the world we just can't comprehend. And we don't know how far. If we are just part of the animal world, as I believe, and I think you believe, then our cognitive capacities are going to be like all our other capacities. They'll have a certain scope, and they'll have certain limits. That's the nature of a biological organism.
You're suggesting that until we know more about the workings of the human mind, or that neuroscience is starting to show us, we can't definitively come down one way or another on the free will question. It's more of a matter of intuition and still in the realm of philosophy?
And Bertrand Russell pointed out back in the 1920s, and I think correctly, that there are several grades of confidence that we have, or we should have, in our belief system. The highest confidence is in our immediate experience. Mm-hmm. The second level of confidence, he said, is in the reports of immediate experience by others who are like us. And the third level, lowest level of confidence, would be in the scientific constructions that we develop to try to make some sense out of our experience. Well, our most immediate experience, I can't think of anything more immediate and less questionable, is that I could decide right now to, say, hang up the phone or start talking about the Boston Red Sox or 1,000 other things, but I'm not going to do it because it wouldn't be appropriate. Our most immediate experience is that we act in ways which are somehow appropriate to situations, which is quite different than saying they're caused by them. Now, maybe there is some way of accounting for our choices in terms of the circumstances in which we're placed and something internal to us. But, that's a thesis.
It's certainly counterintuitive, and I think philosophers who discuss who call themselves determinists, like your friend of mine, Ted Hundrick, would argue that it is counterintuitive, and it may be easier to dismiss what they call counter-causal free will than to affirm pure determinism. But it is a very complex question.
I don't even believe that it's a complex question. I think it's something that we simply do not know. There are a lot of things we don't know. One of them is whether the immediate experience of freedom of will is an illusion, or whether it is in fact an aspect of the universe that we have not yet come to comprehend, and that our cognitive capacities may not allow us to comprehend. Just as our cognitive capacities, if we're serious about it, are like Newton's. They do not allow us to comprehend the fact that action without contact is possible. We accept it, and we understand theories about it. But there's a big difference between intelligibility of theories and intelligibility of the world. In fact, what happened in the Newtonian revolution, took a long time for it to sink in, was that the aspirations of science were lowered. In the early modern scientific revolution, say Galileo up through Newton and beyond, the assumption was, guiding idea was, that the world is a kind of complicated machine, sort of like a clock, the fancy clocks that artisans built, just a lot more complicated, and we can understand it. And our goal is to try to gain the understanding of how this machine works. Well, when Newton came along, he was accused of reviving occult forces, things that a machine can't have, like action at a distance. And he more or less accepted that. And, he's not a fool, Newton, nor were the other great scientists of the day. And in fact, if you look at what really happened over time, the aspirations were lowered, the goals of science were lowered from intelligibility of the world, which we kind of give up, to intelligibility of theoretical explanations of the world, which we hold and try to pursue.
Well, the reason why I'm asking this question at all, because I think it might be important due to the understanding it might offer us on how we treat one another, especially with regard to, say, the criminal justice system. For instance, if we understand that we're not ultimately responsible for our actions, as determinists say, we might want to alter our rather punitive methodology regarding punishment and reward, and we focus our efforts on creating a healthier environment from the get-go.
I agree with your goal, what you're describing, but I think that's totally independent of what speculations we have about the nature of freedom of the will. We do it anyway. In our ordinary lives and in human affairs, we simply take for granted that people have freedom of will just as we see in ourselves, and that they therefore have moral responsibilities. How we proceed to deal with the questions that arise, that's a matter of the level of humanity and of civilization that we've achieved.
There's big debates about freedom of will. It's kind of striking that everyone who participates in these debates, including the people who write learned tomes showing there's no freedom of will, believe in freedom of will. Otherwise, they wouldn't write the learned tomes. If we're all just thermostats of some complicated kind, then what you do is determined, and how people react is determined, so what's the point of the effort? None. So everyone kind of intuitively believes it. We all believe that I can either pick this up or throw it across the room or not do anything with it. But what is it? Well, it lies beyond. I think you can speculate about what the core of the problem is. If you take a look at human science, there are two concepts that are pretty well understood. One of them is determinacy. Something determines something else. The other one is randomness. Things happen without anything determining them. And that's about it, I think. Those are the basic concepts that we comprehend. And freedom of will just doesn't fit in that set of concepts. Well, it could be that this is just another mystery for humans. We don't have the right concept. Some Martian might be looking at us and thinking how stupid we are. Why do we keep the determinacy and randomness when there's obviously that thing out there that I can't point to because I'm a human? It could be. And many other things that seem imponderable might turn out to be like this. Once we recognize that we're not angels, we are just biological organisms, and as such we must have limits. That's just point of logic. You could not have any capacities at all if you didn't have limits, because the capacities determine the limits. And then the question comes, well, what's beyond the limits?
Okay, so that was Chomsky. Now I just want to throw in one more here, Steven Pinker at the end, because I think he makes some good points as well.
I don't believe there's such a thing as free will in the sense of a ghost in the machine, a spirit or soul that somehow reads the TV screen of the senses and pushes buttons and pulls levers of behavior. There's no sense that we can make of that. I think our behavior is the product of physical processes in the brain. On the other hand, when you have a brain that consists of 100 billion neurons connected by 100 trillion synapses, there is a vast amount of complexity that means that human choices will not be predictable in any simple way from the stimuli that have impinged on it beforehand. We also know that that brain is set up so that there are at least two kinds of behavior. There's what happens when I shine a light in your eye and your iris contracts, or I hit your knee with a hammer and your leg jerks upward. We also know that there's a part of the brain that does things like choose what to have for dinner, whether to order chocolate or vanilla ice cream, how to move the next chess piece, whether to pick up the paper or put it down. That is very different from your iris closing when I shine a light in your eye. It's that second kind of behavior, one that engages vast amounts of the brain, particularly the frontal lobes, that incorporates an enormous amount of information in the causation of the behavior, that has some mental model of the world that can predict the consequences of possible behavior and select them on the basis of those consequences. All of those things carve out the realm of behavior that we call free will, which it is useful to distinguish from brute involuntary reflexes, but which doesn't necessarily have to involve some mysterious soul.
So that's interesting. You know, that sounds to me almost like he's a determinist, but he respects that not every facet of life can be sufficiently explained in the same way as one would explain an involuntary reflex. And I think that, you know, some determinists don't seem to make that distinction well. I mean, it just strikes me that, and this is a point I've made before on Secular Talk, is that when you try to boil down all human action as, you know, sort of like exactly what he described there, shining a light in somebody's eye and the iris contracts, or hitting their knee with the little medical hammer and then the leg pops up, you know, or, I don't know, a fart or something like that. Like, it's just kind of natural and it just happened. You know, that when you try to boil down every human action in that kind of a way, there's something about that in a way is almost dehumanizing, because it's taking like the most base aspects, the most primal aspects of our nature, and saying that all higher action can still be kind of broken down into its bare, raw, mechanistic parts. And I like how Steven Pinker points out at the end there that it's useful to come up with this second category that we can call free will, that allows for a kind of complex, really, really complex human action, where, yes, you can take into account somebody's DNA and somebody's entire lived experience and their culture and their environment, and, you know, then you can maybe, with some certainty, predict the action that they take, but let's not kind of boil it down to all being a crude, primitive, reflexive action. And ultimately, I think that's what a hard determinism does, is it takes all human action, and it doesn't allow for that nuance that Steven Pinker laid out here well. And again, to be fair, I think Steven Pinker does kind of fall on the determinist side of the spectrum, judging by his comments here. But what he's saying is you can be a determinist and understand that not all human action is directly comparable, because you can have infinitely more complex human action where even if it's deterministic, it's almost misleading to phrase it that way, like it is deterministic, because it's so complex that the word determinism doesn't really do it justice. So anyway, that's you know, some thoughts here on free will versus determinism. You know, if you ask me, ultimately, where do I fall on this? I don't know. I'm kind of agnostic. I really don't know. I mean, I feel like I might lean in the direction of free will a little bit, but that's totally subjective. It's just based on what I feel is true and not really based on anything else. And I think Chomsky's point kind of resonated with me of like, okay, well, it seems obviously true, but we don't have the capacity to explain it yet, so too bad for our capacity to explain. Like, I feel like that kind of struck a chord with me, but I also don't find Steven Pinker's kind of soft version of determinism here to be off-putting or incorrect. I think it strikes me as pretty reasonable. So I'm pretty agnostic on the question overall. I think I maybe lean slightly in the direction of free will. But anyway, I think this is a really interesting debate, and I hope I gave you a good breakdown of all the different sides of it. And yeah, thanks for watching.